Hey, long time no see. I'm back with You Don't Need to Know This after a bit of a hiatus. So, for a while, I'd been threatening to do a show on the Druglord Empire. And I thought, well, let's restart with this one. But really, this episode should start with a fairy tale, all right? And you've heard this fairy tale. It's the fairy tale of Jack and the Beanstalk. Now, think of this. Think of Jack and the Beanstalk, all right? Jack is a complete idiot who finds himself in another kingdom, steals from it, murders the natives, and somehow walks away as the hero of the story. All right? And really, I was thinking, this is amazing. That's just an amazing inversion of this whole sort of situation today. And then I realized, well, isn't that the story of most colonial countries? I mean, let's talk about our own sort of colonist country, as it were, the United Kingdom. Isn't this the story? I mean, it's really amazing. A developed country, an advanced country, etc., etc. Okay, without getting too histrionic about this, all right. So that's the starting point. This amazing story of Jack and the Beanstalk, where a thief and a murderer is somehow the hero of the story. And it got me to thinking about episodes from history that really matched this amazing theme, right? And one standout episode from history, and the reason that I wanted to talk about this was the Opium Wars of the 1840s. And it is a classic example of how the whole sort of Jack and the Beanstalk uh, version of colonialism worked. So this is what happened, all right? And at the end of this, we will arrive at who the Druglord Empire is, but I'm sure you've already guessed. So what happens is medieval China was an entirely closed society and very inward-looking, right? They the, China was under heaven, which meant there was heaven, there was under heaven, which is China, and there was under heaven, which is pretty much hell, which is the rest of the world, whatever. So everyone else is a yi or a foreign barbarian. I hope I'm getting the pronunciation right. All right. So there's China, closed, inward-looking. Even every nation around it is in awe of its political and economic and military power, and yet China doesn't want to look much beyond this. In the meantime, the Europeans have been traversing the globe in their little wooden ships, and some of them happen upon China. And sometime in the mid 1500s, the Portuguese, who were really the first sort of circumnavigators of the globe, started trading with the Chinese at Macau. This is when China was under the Ming dynasty, right? And so the Portuguese have traded over a period of centuries over there. And here's the thing. Now, China has silk, tea, porcelain, and a whole bunch of other stuff that the Europeans want to import as commodities. And over the next couple of hundred years, there's a lot of outflow of wealth from Europe to China uh, because you want to pay for all these luxuries. So, how does Europe finance this? Well, luckily, when they conquered South America, the Spanish and the Portuguese, they had huge amounts of silver and gold mined or stolen from their South American colonies. So what they were doing is the galleons, the ships loaded with silver, specifically because China wanted to be paid in silver, were sailing from South America through the Philippines, which the Spanish had conquered, into the Chinese ports, specifically Macau first. And they were trading for luxury goods with South American gold and selling that to their markets across Europe. So it was already sort of financed through colonialism, right? So this is happening, and of course, soon the British, decided to kind of get their hand in the game. The East India Company was formed. They had a charter for trade with the East. So trade with China as well comes under the mandate of the British East India Company. So the same problem, right? So everyone wants to buy from China. Boy, does history repeat itself, all right? So everyone wants to buy from China. Nobody's got anything that China wants because China is looking in on itself, all right? So they don't want any of the sort of foreign devilry of machines and things like that. In any case, they've got enough people to do the work of the machines. So the British are figuring out what to do with this balance of payments issue. In the meantime, by 1757, they've gotten a hold of Bengal after the Battle of Palashi, and they have a source of what they think now is a good export. So Bengal was one of the growing areas for opium. All right, the Chinese consumed opium, but perhaps not really in any sort of large scale way. There were a few consumers of opium, usually mixed in with other forms of stimulants such as tobacco, and it wasn't really the most sort of widespread stimulant. And you'll notice I don't use the word drug over here because that has very specific connotations. All right. So as a stimulant, it's being used. So the Brits have captured opium growing areas in Bengal. They set up opium factories, so purification and manufacturing facilities in Calcutta. All right. And from there, they start slowly exporting that to China through certain ports where they're allowed to trade, and not all. So perhaps Macau, perhaps Whampoa, which then got incorporated into Hong Kong. So Whampoa, Kowloon, etc. Specifically, the area of Canton, the Pearl River Delta, which is where they were allowed to kind of trade. The first sort of special economic zone, as it were. So this happens, and then the Brits realize that, hey, we're still losing money on this because not enough opium is going, and we're still getting a hell of a lot of porcelain, silk, tea, etc., etc. So they say, all right, let's do this. Let's start pushing the sale of opium and incentivizing it to Chinese traders. And when we do, we'll grow a market of opium users within China. And then, of course, we'll push the opium we're selling and more, because once the addiction starts. So now what you're doing is you're turning a legal stimulant into an abused substance. All right. And they very deliberately set about doing that, right? Using their merchants in Canton, in the Pearl River Delta, to actually push opium. The Chinese traders were picking up the opium and transporting it to the hinterland, and they literally created a supply situation for this particular abuse substance, and started kind of pushing it to the population at large. Very soon, the drug itself, and now it's become a drug. It's an abuse substance, has found its way all the way to Beijing. So what's happened is they're pushing this drug, they're growing it in India, they're transporting it there, and they're selling it. What's happening is the Chinese are getting increasingly worried about this. The Qing emperor issued a diktat saying that, well, we're going to kind of ban the use of opium outside of these free trade areas. And slowly they got more and more restrictive on the use of opium. They started banning its sale. They started banning trade in opium. And what is happening, obviously, excuse me, is that the British are realizing their revenues are getting cut off. And so finally, in I think about 1839, matters started coming to a head because the Chinese said absolutely no more opium. The Chinese sort of district or regional head went into, I think his name was, I'm really hesitating to say it here, but Lin Zheju, I may be getting this wrong, but Lin Zheju went into the trading areas, and he caused opposition to the whole trade, and he caused the destruction of opium held by the British traders. So long story short, they went in and said, you can't sell this anymore, give us all of it, we're going to burn all of it. And there was a British envoy over there, and the British envoy said, okay, hold on, what we'll do is the British government will pay the traders for the loss in compensation. Now, they've done this, they've made the promise of paying the traders, but the British government doesn't have the money to pay that much money. They just do not have the funds to pay off the traders. So they said, hey, what are you going to do? Let's start a war, right? Because that's how it works. So the British Navy and the Marines and, let me say, 7,000 Indian troops raised from the colony of India have turned up. Not yet the colony of India actually, because it was not yet ruled by the crown. It was ruled by the East India Company. This wasn't until 1857 that, or rather, I think 1859, is after our first war of independence, that rule was transferred to the British crown. So 7,000 Indians as well, in pay of the British East India Company, have turned up in the Pearl River Delta and actually started an invasion of that part of China. Long story short, their technical superiority means that they've defeated the Chinese, and they have thrown open China to the abuse of opium. All right. So this has gone on. The Chinese tried to stop it again, and I think in about 3 years later, there was another war which the Chinese lost again. At this point, Hong Kong has had to be handed over to Britain, and that's how the British acquired the colony of Hong Kong. Until they had to hand it back in 1997, was it? 97, I think. So this is what has happened, all right? And now the British have an area where their drug plants are grown, which is the opium fields, the poppy fields of Bengal. They have their processing areas in Calcutta and various other areas in Howrah, etc. They have the whole transportation and logistics chain, which is the British East India Company ships. And I might add, East India Company ships were, yes, they were built in the UK, especially the warships. A lot of the merchantmen were built in the docks of Bombay, in what is now the Mazgaon dock. And they were built over here, and they were actually used by the British East India Company, to kind of transport opium to China. And a lot of old Indian families, Indian mercantile families, made money because they were shipbuilders for the British East India Company. Do some research and you will find out who these families are. Some of them are still very big today, and they owe a lot of their fortune to the shipbuilding they did and how they contributed to this drug trade. By the way, one of the ships that was built in Bombay has a special place in history because it was the ship on which the Star Spangled Banner was written. This ship was made in Bombay, joined the Royal Navy, took part in the bombardment of the United States Fort McHenry, I think it was. Francis Scott Key was being held prisoner on this ship, and he saw the bombardment of Fort McHenry. He actually sort of wrote the Star Spangled Banner inspired by the defense. This was on HMS Minden. So in the meantime, the Brits have set up their entire drug empire, and this was an empire of drug lords. And really, it was amazing because they controlled it at both ends. All right. So one is they've got strong control over the opium trade at the China end, because they've literally at gunpoint forced the Chinese to accept the opium trade and let millions of their citizens turn into dependent abusers of a particular substance. Oh, and by the way, the British merchants of the Pearl River Delta needed a financial institution that would handle their banking and trading needs. So they came together to create the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. That's right, an iconic brand built like so many others on the back of the opium trade. And the lesson here is, if you commit ethically dubious acts, you're a criminal, possibly. But if your great grandfather committed them, he was a pioneering and visionary entrepreneur. Remember that. The second part of this is that at the Indian end of the trade, what the company had been doing is they've blocked off all the ports. Right, by now, all the company owns all the ports and pretty much all the trade moving in and out of India. Especially after they've annexed Sindh, they've obviously own Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay. So they've kind of covered all their bases. And what they've done is they have disallowed the export of opium by any independent agent out of India, so through their ports. So how this works is, so Malwa used to grow a lot of opium as well, all right, not under company territory. And they said, so obviously the company is allowing their own opium to be exported. Malwa's production of opium is sort of lying there, stacking up huge losses, huge problems. So what's happening is the native sellers, the sort of growers of Malwa turn to the company and say, look, you know what, fine, we'll sell our opium to you directly. And so they say, all right, you're going to sell it to us and we're going to price this according to, for our benefit. And so they've picked up the opium at whatever price. And of course, then it's pushed into their value chain and head straight to China. And so look at how much of modern trade has really grown out of the opium trade. The whole idea of the value chain, the whole idea of the logistics chain, the idea of globalization. Now, I'll tell you why globalization and free trade, where they worked over here. The amazing part of this is part of the reason why the company had so much support and why the British government was finally obliged to wage war on behalf of the company in China was because the company said the Chinese are blocking free trade. All right. So this is fairly soon after Adam Smith has written The Wealth of Nations, and so they've cottoned on to his ideas very fast, and they've kind of said, all right, we're going to use this towards our end, and therefore you can't block free trade. Therefore, you're being unfair, and therefore we're going to do, sort of force war upon you. But of course, karma is a dog of the female persuasion. The long term effect of this is that obviously, when you unleash something and you unleash it to be abused in the way that opium was, what you're also doing is you're setting up a cycle where the effects are going to find their way back to you. So before long, opium was easily available and fairly frequently used within English society as well. You'd have poets like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Elizabeth Barrett Browning. A lot of them actually used opium recreationally. All right. In fact, a huge amount actually starts getting imported back into Britain. All right. So what's happening in the meantime is that the whole idea of recreational substance usage and then that sort of develops sometimes into recreational substance abuse, that cycle has started kind of evolving in the West as well. In the meantime, in 1827, Merck and company start manufacturing morphine. All right, and this is important because soon as governments all over the West start cracking down on the use of opium. So, for example, in the West, they banned the use of opium everywhere except in Chinatowns and opium dens, and where sailors gather, for example. And so there's bans all over the US and the UK, but the addicts or the addict ecosystem already exists. So what's happening in the meantime is soon they figure out, in the meantime, on the medical side, doctors are finding out that you can inject morphine, and obviously the reason for creating and sort of using morphine at a medical level is to dull pain and to use as a sedative. But behavioral modification is exactly what the addicts are looking for, right? And dulling pain as well. I'm not going to get into the whole sort of psychological trauma side of drug usage and substance abuse, but I think we all know it's there. So what's happening is opium is getting mainstreamed, in the West, and soon you have other substances. You have manufactured substances such as morphine, and then heroin, all right, which happened, which is the Bayer company. And the reason, by the way, all these German companies are coming up with all these drugs is not because of some. It's basically Germany was the world leader in chemistry for the longest time, and so they were experimenting with all these chemicals, and they came up with A morphine and then B heroin, and so heroin, for example, was being used as a morphine step down cure, which meant that if you were a morphine addict, you were given heroin to kind of, because it was diluted morphine. So you know where this is going. It doesn't make things better. It actually makes things worse. And so you have this gigantic sort of, dependency situation growing all over the West. In the meantime, you have the invention, or rather the processing of coca, or the coca leaf, which was kind of used like pan was in India. It was used like that in South America, right? The chewing the coca leaf was actually a mild stimulant. Perhaps a little stronger than pan and tuna, perhaps. And so the use of coca was then sort of used as a stimulant. It was purified and turned into cocaine. We know the story. And it found its way into Coca-Cola and various other products. Cocaine at one point was very highly prized as a stimulant, and it gave you all the energy. And if you do a little research and look at advertisements from the 1910s and 20s, you'll find some hilarious ads pushing for the use of cocaine and saying, "Hey, doctors recommend this, do it." So what's happening is it's kind of slowly growing out of control. All right, and here's the issue: this whole situation has been bred from a point of how do I handle the balance of payments and the outgoing of silver to China. So what's really important to remember over here is that the historical context of all the stuff you see on Netflix, the whole Narcos and the Pablo Escobar story and all of that, the historical context of how it has grown into a truly globalized industry, how it has kind of been its history of manufacture, purification, and then its history of insertion into cultures is something that was driven from the top down. It was driven by governments, it was driven by the mercantile class, and its effects are being felt today on the most disadvantaged and the most underprivileged classes across the world. The effects of the so called war on drugs are being found all over Latin America today. But why Latin America? All over the world. In Afghanistan, the NATO alliance is paying farmers not to grow poppies to cut down on the heroin trade. And the heroin that finds its way into India, it finds its way into the Middle East, finds its way into Europe and the United States as well. And so they're paying the farmers to cut down on the poppy growing. However, the reason the farmers are growing that level of poppy in any case is not because, as opium used to be about a century and a half or 2 centuries ago, a very light recreational stimulant, but because over a period of a century, poppy was seen as a cash crop. And first opium itself and then heroin as a dilute of opium was seen as a great way to make money by the people who are fighting it today. Now, I'm not going to get into the pros and cons of substance abuse. It's very clearly there is a human issue, and there are huge human cons over there. There are huge societal cons, and there's a lot of damage being caused by substance abuse. But it is something that is a created problem, quite literally a manufactured problem. Today, there is a war on drugs. 150 odd years ago, 170 years ago, there was a war for drugs. And so, if this is an issue that can be addressed in one way, it can be addressed in the other. I think there's a lot of conversation about how this can be addressed. And I'm not going to really get into that. There are a lot of points pro and against legalization. And, they're already illegal. How do we deal with this as societies? But what's really important to remember is let's take a step back. It's great to look at documentaries today. It's great to look at TV shows today. It's great to kind of have fun with them. But it's great to also take a step back and look at why we've reached where we have today. And maybe that will help us sort of roll this whole thing back and bring us to a point where perhaps the recreational use of natural stimulants is something that doesn't need to be policed. But, obviously there's a line there. And I'll leave it to the experts to figure out where that line is. All right. And two, I am begging all of you who are parents or all of you who are in some sort of position to influence young minds to please change the way you tell the story of Jack and the Beanstalk. It is a horrifying story of thievery and murder. So frame it as such. And maybe the ending changes where the little bugger falls off the damn beanstalk and breaks his head. Or maybe 100 years later, all the giants are back. And this time, well, they're not going to listen to anyone anymore. That's really the Druglord Empire episode. I'm so happy to be back. I hope to be regular once again. Let me know what you think. Looking forward to hearing from you all, and I'd love to hear ideas on what further episodes can be all about. Thanks so much for listening. Ciao.